All right, in the second section of Chapter 1, we are going to talk about what is life, and then we'll talk about kind of how we organize life into different groups, and then talk about the diversity of life a little bit, and talk about this thing called phylogeny, and these things called phylogenetic trees, and then kind of get into some of the different sub-disciplines of biology here. So again, as a reminder, it's a really good idea to have your study guide with you, looking at that as we go through the lectures so that you can be filling that out, and that will help you study for the test. Okay, so let's get into what are the properties of life? Okay, so I have a picture of a bunch of different things here. Not all of them are living things. So I want you to go ahead and look at these different things. We have a sloth here. We have the corpse flower here. We have some little parasites with blood cells around them, bacteria, mushrooms. We have a human being in a cave full of crystals. And we have what's called a bacteriophage. It's a virus that infects bacteria. So I want you to think about these things and think about what's living in here, what would be covered under biology, and why you think it's that. So go ahead and pause the video, kind of jot some things down, think about that, and then we'll come back and discuss it. All right, so you probably grouped the sloth into biology. We probably grouped the parasites into biology, the red blood cells. Certainly the bacteria, yep, that's definite, yep. The mushroom, for sure. Corpse flower, yep, on it. People, yeah, there's a whole bunch of biology that deals with people. When it came to the crystals, you probably said no. And think about why that is. Okay, bacteriophage, the virus that infects bacteria, you probably grouped that into life. That one might be surprising to you because no, it's not considered living. The bacteria is, but the virus is not. But we study viruses in biology. That's a bit of a conundrum. So what makes these things living? Well, I'll go through a whole list of things, but you probably said it moves, okay? But then again, plants don't really move. Although they do move, just on a different time scale, right? Bacteria can like twitch and move around a little bit. How about growth? Well, yeah, all of these things grow. But you probably said crystals weren't living. But crystals grow, right? They get bigger and they grow. So what makes them non-living? What makes the virus non-living? Obviously, these are kind of arbitrary definitions. We've created them as human beings, but we have grouped life based on these following criteria. Okay, so life needs to be ordered. Basically, that means for us, life consists of one or more cells, and we will talk about what a cell is, but that is our most basic unit of life. So if we go back to our crystals, crystals are not made up of cells, so they're not living. How about the virus? The virus is actually not made up of a cell. It uses cells, but it is not a cell itself, so that is non-living. There's a couple of other things here. Sensitivity or response to stimuli. Crystals, maybe, not really. Like, you shine a light on a crystal, it doesn't like grow towards the light. So that's out. Reproduction. This one's tough. Crystals kind of reproduce, but not really. Like, they're not made up of cells, so the cells don't divide. They're just chemicals that form a lattice shape. But the virus, well, viruses do reproduce, but the way they reproduce is they go into another cell, into a living cell, and they hijack it and use it to make themselves. A virus is composed of a protein and a nucleic acid or a genetic material. We'll learn about these things in a moment in the coming lectures, but they're not cells, and they can't reproduce on their own. They need other cells, living cells, to reproduce. They need a cell, a living cell, to reproduce, and they are not made of cells. So viruses don't reproduce on their own. Adaptation, evolution by natural selection, things that enhance reproductive potential are positive adapters. Otherwise, an organism may go extinct. Now, this is where it gets weird because viruses can evolve. We've seen different COVID strains have evolved, but they're not living. So viruses kind of like are this weird breakdown between like biology, are they not biology? We tend to lump them in biology, but by technical definition, they're not living. Growth and development. Again, we said crystals do. This process called development, that is a little bit more nuanced. That's like you start as a single cell and you become all these different types of cells, liver cells, eyeball cells. But bacteria don't really do that. So this here definition kind of breaks down as well. Regulation / homeostasis. This is a big one. You stay at a steady state. If you're not doing homeostasis, no chemistry is going on in your body to keep you regulated and you are dead. Energy processing and metabolism. You do this. We'll talk a lot about this. Viruses do not do this. They don't do any metabolism. They're not living. Same thing with crystals. They don't metabolize. And then a little bit with adaptation, evolution is there as well. So these are our properties of life. Okay, so hopefully that kind of clears it up. But again, we're trying to group nature, which is like a spectrum, into fine little boxes for ourselves. All right, so living versus non-living, some definitions there. How do we organize life then? So we're going to go back to our scale of nature, and we're going to start on the small end, and we're going to work our way up towards the larger end of this scale. Okay, so for us, at the bottom, we're going to talk about atoms, okay? Atoms, they are made up of technically subatomic particles, but by normal means, an atom is basically the smallest unit of matter we can get to. They are composed of subatomic particles called protons, neutrons, and electrons. Hopefully you've heard of these before. You'll learn all about them in chemistry, which I highly recommend taking. We will talk about atoms in future lectures when we do our overview of chemistry. Okay, molecules. This is more than one atom chemically bonded together. So we have one atom. They are connected by what we call a chemical bond in some way. That is a molecule. Now, that could be two of the same type of element, two oxygens together. That's what's floating around in the atmosphere. Or it could be many different types, some carbon, some oxygen, some nitrogen, phosphorus, hydrogens all together. That's what makes up most of us, right? So those are bonded together to form molecules. And molecules, because they're made up of multiple atoms, are bigger. We have this term macromolecules. Macro means large, so these are large molecules. Generally what we call polymers. A polymer, you've probably heard of it, it is a chain of what we call monomers. So think of a monomer like a single building block. When you stick them together, you get a chain. We call that a polymer. Poly means many. Mono means one. Okay, so for us, these macromolecules, there's 4 types of biological macromolecules. Hopefully you've heard of these. We have carbohydrates. Those are our sugars. We have lipids. Those are fats and oils. We have proteins, which are made up of these things called amino acids. And then we have what are called nucleic acids. You might not have heard them called that, but you have definitely heard of these molecules. We have one that is called DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. That is a genetic storage material. And then we have RNA, which you've probably heard of mRNA vaccines now. We'll learn about those. That is ribonucleic acid. This is a little bit more of a short-term, intermediate, and it can do some things that we'll learn about. But they are both what we call nucleic acids. So those are our 4 biological macromolecules. We're going to talk a lot about those in this course because they're kind of like the main building blocks that make up what we're going to talk about in our scale of biology here. Okay, then we have our first bit where we can be living, right? Cells. Cells are membrane-bound compartments where chemical reactions can happen. This is our smallest unit of life. So they are bound by some sort of membrane, which is generally made up of lipids, and inside of that, unique chemical reactions can occur that wouldn't happen outside of it, and that's what enables life. So, bacteria are our smallest cells. Now, viruses, we talked about those and what's living, non-living. Viruses are made up of nucleic acid and protein together, but they're not membrane enclosed. They don't do chemical reactions inside there. So they are smaller and non-living. Bacteria are our smallest living organisms. Cells often contain compartments inside of them. Bacteria and this other group called Archaea do not have this, but the eukaryotic cells, which are animals, plants, fungi, this group called the protists, they are all eukaryotic, and they contain small compartments inside their cells called organelles. Now, you've probably heard of one of the organelles. You're going to be asked, what did I learn in biology? And you're probably going to say, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, right? A mitochondria is a small organelle inside of a eukaryotic cell. Bacteria don't have organelles. They don't have mitochondria. We'll learn all about that. There's actually an interesting relationship between bacteria and mitochondria that's super cool. We'll come to that in the metabolism chapter, in the cell chapter as well. Okay, so cells, that's our basic unit of life. How do we organize our life? We're going to start at the top. We have this group called domains. Now, you might not have heard of the domains of life, but you probably have heard of the kingdoms of life, right? And then philo, order, class, family, genus, species, whatever it is. Domain is at the top there. So you probably heard of the different kingdoms of life, plants, animals, right? Fungi, things like that. Well, domains is a little bit higher. And we break the domains up based on whether organisms are prokaryotes or eukaryotes. What is that? I'll get to that in a moment. Let's talk about the three domains of life first. In first domain, we have bacteria. You've probably heard of bacteria. We have a second domain called Archaea. We'll get to them in a moment. Eukaryotes is our other domain. Okay, bacteria and Archaea are both prokaryotes. Eukaryotes are eukaryotes. That one's easy. All right, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a prokaryote versus a eukaryote? Well, it has to do with evolution and the cell construction. So I'm going to start with the eukaryotes, actually, because it's a little bit easier to see what you need to have to be a eukaryote rather than what you don't have to be a prokaryote. So eukaryotes, primarily, the big difference here is that they have this thing called a nucleus. The nucleus is a bit of membrane inside of the cell. So here's the cell membrane. Inside of the cell, there's an extra membrane, and contained in there is the genetic material, the DNA. The other things you see in here are what are called organelles. We have the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi, mitochondria, chloroplasts if they're plant, and this thing called a lysosome. Organelles are just little sacs of membrane. Why does this matter? Well, organelles allow you to have different types of chemical reactions in different places in the cell. So your DNA, your genetic material, that's really important, right? You don't want that to get messed up. Lysosomes are places where things like proteins and stuff are broken down. They have very toxic, harsh chemicals inside of them. You don't want those chemicals getting anywhere near your DNA. Having them packaged up in two different compartments allows for that to happen. So, eukaryotes have a nucleus and organelles. I'll get to this third point in a moment. Don't look too hard at it yet. Prokaryotes, on the other hand, do not have a nucleus. They do not have organelles. So, bacteria and Archaea. Evolutionarily, these evolved before eukaryotes. We'll talk about how eukaryotes evolved. It's super cool. And it has to do with these mitochondria as well. But prokaryotes, bacteria, and Archaea, no nucleus, no organelle. Now, most eukaryotes are multicellular organisms. Let's back up and talk about what an organism is. An organism is an individual living thing, right? So each one of these rods here is an E. coli organism, okay? I am an organism. You are another human organism, right? Bacteria and Archaea are single-celled organisms. One cell is one organism. You are a multi-celled organism. You have many cells, possibly trillions of cells, that make up your body. There are, however, single-celled eukaryotes. If you've heard of parasitic diseases like Giardia, Giardia is a single-celled eukaryote that can cause disease. Causes what we call beaver fever. Comes when you drink contaminated water in a lake or a stream or something like that, and it can cause disease. It is a single-celled eukaryote. So all prokaryotes are single-celled. Not all eukaryotes are multi-celled. Some are single-celled. So that's something that people commonly miss. But the defining features is prokaryotes have no nucleus and no organelles. Eukaryotes have a nucleus and have organelles. Oftentimes they're multicellular, but not all. So what's in the eukaryotes? Well, we have our animals, we have plants, we have fungi, and we have this group called the protists. The protists have a lot of the single-celled things in there. It's kind of a catch-all term for weird stuff that's eukaryotic, but we didn't know how to group it until quite recently. Okay, so that's our top level of kind of organizing the living things into groups, right? And we base it on the cell type. Is it eukaryotic or is it prokaryotic? Okay, we're going to continue on with some terms that will only apply to eukaryotes and primarily to humans and animals, because a lot of biology gets focused on animals because we care about humans because we are humans and we're selfish. But a lot of biology is involved in medicine. We like keeping ourselves alive. But we have groupings. So when you have a multicellular organism and you have a group of similar cells doing a similar function, we call that a tissue. Okay, so here you can see our flow chart. Inside of cells, we might have organelles if they're eukaryotic. Those cells could be specialized, like blood cells or liver cells or things like that. A group of those cells together doing a similar function, we might call a tissue, like skin, right? You have epidermis, you have endodermis, you might have some muscle cells there or some subcutaneous fat cells or something like that. I apologize, I don't know my anatomy well enough to tell you which each of these layers is. I'm going to go, this is the epidermis because it's on the outside, but I can't tell you what these different ones are. I'm a plant guy, not a human guy. I apologize. So, but a tissue is human skin or something like that. We might also have something called an organ, collections of tissues grouped together to do a common function. Now, that might be your liver or your spleen or your heart or your eyeballs, right? But your eyeballs are connected to your brain. Why do we say they're different organs? This is where it gets kind of arbitrary, right? We got to decide how to do it. And different organisms, we decide on different things. Like plants, we have different organs like the flower and the leaf and the roots and the stem. But you might argue where one starts and one stops is kind of hard to differentiate. Okay, then we have the organism. I want to be really clear with this terminology because some people mishear me or things like that. Organisms are individual living entities, okay? Do not confuse this term with organs. I know it's very close to each other, but organism is the individual living thing. Me versus you versus whoever else is in your life, right? Each of us are an individual organism, right? So that is an organism, okay? And then we have higher groupings here that we're going to get into. All right, so we have 3 more terms. We're going to talk less about these in this course, but in BIO202, you will talk a lot about these because we're going to talk in that course about the interaction between many organisms. But when we get all individuals of a species, of one species, living in a specific area, so all the elk that live in the Idaho Falls region, we would call that a population. Now, how do we define the Idaho Falls population versus the Teton population versus the Yellowstone population? Well, that's where it gets a little tough, and people argue about those definitions, right? But for us, we're just going to say all of the individuals of a species, of a single species, living in a specific area. Don't worry about what the definition of a specific area is. You can argue about that in BIO202. A community is a higher level when we talk about all of the different populations in a particular area. So population was all of the elk in Idaho Falls, or we could talk about a population of sagebrush in Idaho Falls, all the sagebrush in Idaho Falls. But what about when we talk about the sagebrush and the elk and all the other living species in Idaho Falls? That would be a community, right? Again, don't worry about what the particular area definition is. There can be different ones. And then we have an ecosystem. Now, ecosystem involves things that are abiotic. So bio meant life, right? So a means not living things in a particular area. So this is both the living things and the non-living things. So how do the rocks and the streams impact the sagebrush and the elk that are living here? That would be the ecosystem, right? And then when we go to the highest level, we talk about the biosphere. That encompasses all of Earth. Okay. We're going to go back down. We're going to go back to just living things. How do we define living things? How do we define a species? That's a really big question. Okay. How do we group living things? Like, how do we group species and what's related to what? All right. So, I have a bunch of different organisms here. We have like a gecko thing here, a little lizard. We have a plant, petunia. We have some bacteria swimming around next to these red blood cells. We have a fungus here, and we have a paramecium or amoeba, little single-celled eukaryote. So how do we group this? Well, we kind of already talked about it, right? We know that these are single-celled organisms that don't have a nucleus, okay? But these are single-celled organisms, but they do have a nucleus. So we group them differently. All of these over here, all of these cells have eukaryotic properties. They have organelles and nuclei. The bacteria do not have organelles. They do not have a nucleus. These are all prokaryotes. This is in a domain called bacteria. But what about these? Think about this. If you thought about these evolutionarily, what do you think would be most related to one another? Okay, think about it for a sec. Okay, you probably think that the plants and these fungi here are most closely related. They grow in the same place. They kind of live the same way, right? They grow up out of the soil. They're very slow. They don't move around in a time scale that we can see. You would actually be wrong with that. The animal, the gecko here, and the fungus here, the mushroom, are actually evolutionarily more closely related than this to the plant or that to the plant. These are more closely related. That blows people's mind because oftentimes in botany classes we study mushrooms because we used to think that they were more closely related, but they're not. How do we know that? This is where a topic called phylogenetics comes in. So, you may have heard of the tree of life. This is judging how things are evolutionarily related. That's the process that we call phylogeny. It is a science called phylogeny. Okay, how do we read this tree of life? Well, it's kind of difficult in this example, but at some point, life on Earth started. We have some hypotheses of that, but without a time machine, we can't be fully certain. We think that some lipids bound around some genetic material, probably RNA, and then some chemical reactions were enabled, and so we had, at some point, the beginning of life. That's down here at the bottom of this tree. As we go upwards, we're going through time. Anywhere that we have what is called a node, an intersection of these two branches, there was some sort of common ancestor. So let's look at this tree, and this is a broad tree. This is organizing the domains of life. Remember, I said there are three. There are the bacteria, those are prokaryotic. There are the archaea, those are also prokaryotic. And then we have the eukarya, which are eukaryotes. In there are the things that you might be concerned with. Animals, you're right there. Fungi, which are actually more closely related to animals than plants. And then we have all these other groups, the ciliates, slime molds, entamoeba, flagellates, trichomonads, all these other things. These generally get grouped into the kingdom that we call protists, although you will note they are evolutionarily distinct lineages. Okay. So the branch lengths indicate time, how long ago they evolved. This group called Archaea, they kind of look like bacteria, and many of them are what we call extremophiles. Here you have the Thermoproteus. These probably live in hot water like Yellowstone. There's a lot of Archaea in Yellowstone. Halophiles, they like salty conditions. They're their own group, though. They're actually more closely related to us than bacteria. And we only discovered them in like the late 60s, 1970s. We didn't know that there were these two different groups until we started sequencing their DNA. In the bacteria, we have gram-positives, gram-negatives. The gram-negative bacteria tend to cause a lot of enteric problems, diarrhea. We got things like E. coli, salmonella in there. But we also have things like cyanobacteria, which are photosynthetic, and all kinds of other things that are in there, but their own distinct group. So this is examining evolutionary relatedness. And you can't do that based on just what they look like. Okay, right? Because if I did that, I'd be like, well, the gecko's green and the plant is green. Gecko, plant, related, right? Like, or the mushroom doesn't move and the plant doesn't move, related. That's not in reality how it shook out, right? They happen to be similar, but they evolved at different times. So what do we need to do to make a phylogeny? What do we need to look at? Hopefully you're thinking in your mind the genetic material, DNA. By examining the DNA, we can look to see how these organisms have evolved. And the science of phylogeny, the study of phylogeny, it might seem boring, like just grouping things here, but it's actually going back in time and trying to figure out how things evolved and where their most common ancestor would have been. Oftentimes we can put time scales on this by looking at geology and fossils, right? So that's where our other natural sciences come in. Okay, so that's phylogeny, grouping things by evolutionary relatedness. But how do we order those things? Well, this is the science of what we call taxonomy. Taxonomy is basically like naming groups and grouping things that are hopefully evolutionarily related together. So at the top of our taxonomy, we have the domains. We have our bacteria, our archaea, and our eukaryotes. Hint, hint, I'm going to keep repeating that. Might show up on a test. What are the 3 domains of life? Okay. Then under that, we have the kingdoms, okay? We have the plants, animals, fungi, protists in eukaryotes. I'm not going to ask you to memorize those. Phyla, class, orders, families, genus, and species. How these get broken down varies by field, right? A plant family may be far more diverse than an animal family. They're not really comparable per se. There are some rules, but taxonomists love to argue about what is the same species, what is different. There's a lot of different definitions of species. One of them that works well for animals is, can they reproduce together, right? We have a few exceptions. We have the liger, which is a hybrid lion and tiger, right? There, the definition kind of breaks down. Some people use definitions in terms of regionality, right? Like, sure, this plant lives over here, and technically it can reproduce with this plant, but there's a mountain range in between them, and naturally, in nature, they don't reproduce. But if I took some pollen from one, I could fertilize the other. I'm not going to get into that definition. It's really hard when you talk about bacteria, which don't do sexual reproduction. So other classes will deal with that later. I just want to plant the seed there of what a species is. It's difficult. All right. Here's a review question, right? What is the main difference between a prokaryote and a eukaryote? Go and pause the video. Think about that answer. All right. Hopefully, you started with prokaryotes don't have a nucleus, eukaryotes do have a nucleus, and prokaryotes don't have organelles, eukaryotes do have organelles. Some of you might have said eukaryotes are multicellular, prokaryotes are single cellular. Remember, that's not technically true. There are single cellular eukaryotes as well. All right, let's go into a little bit deeper. Which of these domains of life are prokaryotic? Okay, pause the video. Think about that. Hopefully you chose bacteria and archaea as our prokaryotes, and eukaryotes are not prokaryotic, right? So bacteria, archaea are prokaryotes, eukaryotes are eukaryotes. Perfect. Okay, so with that, we have some basis to really get started. So in chapter 1.2, we talked about what it means to be living. They got to have these key properties: order. For us, that meant they were composed of cells. Sensitivity, or the ability to respond to stimuli. They need to reproduce, have adaptation, growth, and development. Regulation / homeostasis, so they got to do chemical reactions inside that keep them at a steady state. Energy processing and metabolism, and they have to evolve. Remember, some things fall into that. Viruses fall into some of these, but not all of them, so they're not considered living. There are many different levels of organization that we can apply to living things. We talked about stuff down at the molecular level, and we can look all the way up to that biosphere level, right? We're going to stick down lower in this course. We talked about phylogeny. This is grouping organisms based on their evolutionary relatedness, and that builds basically a tree of life. And then at the top level of our taxonomy, of our organizing of organisms, we have our three domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. Eukaryotes have the nucleus and have membrane-bound organelles. Okay, that does it for chapter 1. Hopefully you're excited. We're going to continue on. We're going to get even nittier and grittier here, and then we'll continue to work up as we go along in the chapters. All right, see you in chapter 2.